The lamb was dying when Dura Ironhide found it, and she should have walked past it. A soldier does not stop for lambs. A warrior does not kneel in the mud of a stranger's field. But 30 battles had wrung something loose in her chest that she could no longer name, and so she stopped, and she knelt, and she wept. The animal lay on its side in the frost-bitten grass at the edge of a split-rail fence, its fleece matted with mud, and a thin smear of blood along its left flank where something had torn at it and given up. Its eyes were open, pale gold and trembling with that particular terror that only the nearly dead possess. Its ribs rose and fell in shallow, desperate flickers. It was no bigger than a sack of grain. It was entirely helpless. Dura had not cried since the battle at the Stoneback Ridge 3 years ago, when she had watched her clan mother take an arrow through the throat and go down without a sound. She had not cried then, not truly, not with the throat-tightening, eye-burning kind of grief that undoes a person. She had fought through it as she had always done, blade in hand and fury in her lungs. That was what she was made for. That was what the elders had told her, since she was old enough to hold a spear. But looking at this lamb, this small, stupid, perfect creature that had done nothing except be born into a world too rough for it, something in Dura Ironhide cracked open like old timber in a flood. She did not hear the man approaching. That alone told her how far gone she was, because Dura heard everything. She could hear a twig snap at 40 paces in a windstorm. She could count the footsteps of an enemy column from the far side of a hill. She had survived 30 battles partly by listening. But she had her hands curled around the lamb's ribcage, willing warmth into it, and her face was wet, and she heard nothing until the voice came from right behind her. "That is Maggie's last lamb." I thought the fox got it for certain. She was on her feet and turned before the second syllable finished, her hand going to the long-handled knife at her hip, but she did not draw it, because the man standing at the fence gate was not raising a weapon. He was holding a bucket and a coil of rope, and he was looking not at her face or at her tusks or at the green-gray cast of her skin, but at the lamb. His name, she would learn, was Jacob Walker. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, lean and broad-shouldered the way a man who works his own land becomes lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair pushed back under a worn felt hat and a jaw shadowed with several days of growth. His coat was a heavy canvas thing, patched at the elbows, and his boots were caked with the same red clay mud that coated the fence posts. He had brown eyes, the kind that picked up light the way still water does, and right now those eyes were moving from the lamb to her with an expression she had never once seen on a human face directed at her. It was not fear. It was not hatred. It was not the cold, measuring look of a soldier deciding whether she was worth the trouble of killing. It was concern. Plain, unguarded, genuine concern for the lamb. "Is it still breathing?" he asked. Dura realized her hand had relaxed away from her knife. She looked down at the animal at her feet. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Crying always did that. He was already moving, setting his bucket down against the fence post and coming through the gate without hesitation, crouching beside the lamb with the easy familiarity of a man who had done this 100 times. He ran his hands along its flanks, lifted the edge of the wool to check the wound, pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point at its throat. "Fox got it through the fence last night," he said quietly. "I thought it was dead at dawn." He glanced up at her. He was crouching, which put his face roughly at the level of her knee, and he had to tip his head back to look at her. He did it without any sign of the flinching she usually inspired. "Did you stop the bleeding? This wound is clotted." "I pressed my hands to it," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded as though that was a perfectly ordinary thing for an orc woman to have done in a field before sunrise. "Help me carry it inside," he said. "The barn is warm. If it makes the next few hours, it will likely live." She should not have agreed. She was traveling west, away from the territories where her clan had fought their last losing battle, away from everything she had known for the 26 years of her life. She had nothing but a bedroll, a travel pack, her knife, and the fitted leather armor she wore dark-coiled leather vest laced tight over a rust-colored linen shirt that was tucked into her riding trousers. The whole ensemble worn smooth and shaped to her frame by years of use, cinched at the waist with a broad belt from which her knife hung. She had not planned to stop at any farm. She had not planned to stop anywhere. But she bent down and scooped the lamb up against her chest, and she followed Jacob Walker into his barn. The barn was small and warm, lit by a hanging lantern that cast everything in amber. It smelled of hay and horses, and the good clean smell of livestock kept in reasonable comfort. There were 2 horses in their stalls, a gray mare and a younger roan gelding, and they shifted at Dura's entrance but did not panic, which she noted with something like gratitude. Animals were honest about their feelings. The horses looked at her, decided she was not a threat, and went back to their hay. She wished people were as sensible. Jacob cleared a stall and laid fresh straw, and she set the lamb down in it. And for the next hour they worked side by side him, mixing a warm mash with milk and grain, her holding the animal steady while he coaxed it to drink, her holding the lantern close while he cleaned and dressed the wound with cloth strips soaked in a clear spirit that smelled medicinal and sharp. Neither of them spoke much. There was something comfortable in that, in the shared focus of a task that mattered, and Dura found herself breathing more slowly than she had in weeks. When the lamb finally took a full swallow and then another, Jacob sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath that turned to mist in the cold air. "There she goes," he said softly. He looked up at Dura with that same unguarded expression. "Thank you, truly." Dura had been thanked before. In her clan, after a battle, the war chief would sometimes say words of acknowledgement to those who had fought well. That was acknowledgement, not gratitude. This was different. This man was looking at her the way people look at someone who has done something genuinely valuable, and he meant it, and it sat strangely in her chest. "I was passing through," she said. "I should go." "It is about 4 hours until full light," he said, looking toward the barn door where the darkness outside was still complete. "There is a storm coming from the north. I can feel it in the air. You would be walking into it." He stood, brushing straw from his knees. "I am not going to pretend I do not know what you are, or that things are not complicated between our kinds out here in the territories. But you helped my lamb, and I have a good stove and a spare room, and it is going to snow before morning." The directness of it struck her. He was not pretending the difficulty did not exist. He was acknowledging it and stepping past it in the same breath. That was either tremendous naivety or tremendous character, and something in the way he stood straight, without any of the nervous overcorrectness of someone performing tolerance, told her it was the latter. "I am not going to rob you," she said flatly, because she had learned it was better to say these things aloud. "I did not think you were," he said, equally flat, equally simple. The snow came before sunrise, as he had predicted, and Dura Ironhide did not leave that morning. She slept on a narrow cot in the room he gave her, under 2 heavy wool blankets that smelled of cedar and old wood smoke, and she slept harder and deeper than she had in months, which frightened her when she woke because she had not meant to lower her guard that completely. But the room was quiet, and the stove ticked and popped in the next room, and something in her body had simply decided it was safe enough to rest. She found him at the kitchen table when she rose, a mug of something hot in his hand and a second one set out already for her. He did not make a production of it. He said good morning and pushed the mug toward her and asked if she had eaten, and when she said not since yesterday, he got up and made eggs on the iron stove and put bread on to toast and acted as though feeding an orc warrior in his kitchen was the most ordinary thing that had ever happened to him. She ate. The eggs were good. The bread was thick and dark, and she ate 3 slices. "Where are you headed?" he asked, not pressing, just filling the silence. "West," she said, "away from the eastern territories. There is nothing left for me there." He absorbed that without prying. She watched him for any sign of the calculation she was used to seeing. How dangerous is she? What does she want? How do I get her gone? And found none of it. He was watching the snow fall outside the single kitchen window, and his expression was one of simple companionship. "My homestead is about 2 miles from the nearest town," he he said after a while. "Redgate. It is not friendly to anyone who is not human, I will warn you honestly. The frontier attracts a certain kind of person, and the Eastern Orc campaigns did not help." He looked at her directly. "If you need to rest a few days before moving on, you can do that here without going into town." Dura turned this over. "Why?" "Because the storm is going to last," he said, nodding at the window where the snow was now falling thick and sideways. "And because you look like you have been walking for a long time, and because you were kind to my lamb." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. He was comfortable with her gaze, which was unusual. Most humans found orc eyes unsettling, the color of them, the intensity. Dura's eyes were the deep amber gold that came from her mother's line, and she had been told since childhood that she looked dangerous when she looked directly at someone. Jacob Walker seemed to find it merely honest. "A few days," she said. She stayed 2 weeks. The farm had its rhythms, and she fell into them without entirely meaning to. Jacob worked hard and steadily, and without complaint, mending the fence where the fox had broken through, clearing snow from the paths between the barn and the house, chopping firewood, checking his grain stores, tending his small flock of 8 sheep, including the recovering lamb, which he called Pearl and which followed him around the yard with embarrassing devotion the moment she was strong enough to stand. Dura found herself working alongside him, first just helping with the heavier lifting because it was faster and she had nothing else to do, and then gradually because she liked the work. She had not done this kind of work before. Her whole life had been the clan camp, the training ground, the march and the battle and the march home. She had chopped wood with an axe for fuel, but never as part of a daily routine that had this particular satisfaction to it, the satisfaction of building rather than destroying. Splitting logs with the big axe Jacob kept by the chopping block, she fell into a rhythm that was almost meditative, and once she looked up from her work to find him leaning on the fence watching her with an expression that was warm and quiet and difficult to interpret, and he said, "You are the most efficient person I have ever watched work." And she did not know what to do with that, so she just went back to splitting wood. They talked in the evenings by the stove, while the snow came down outside. He was from a settlement 3 territories east, she learned, the son of farmers who had both died when a fever swept through the valley 7 years ago. He had come west to this parcel of land because there was space here and the soil was good, and he had wanted to build something of his own. He had been here 4 years. He had neighbors a mile out in either direction, and he traded in Redgate, and he was on civil if not warm terms with most people. He was not married and had not been. She told him less, but she told him more than she had ever told a human. She told him about her clan, the Ironhide clan of the Eastern Ranges, a warrior people who had fought 6 human armies over 3 generations, and whose numbers had been cut by 2/3 in the last campaign. She told him she had fought her first battle at 18, which was the custom. You did not fight before you were a woman grown. She told him she had fought in 30 battles. She said it flatly, without pride or shame, just the truth of a life. He did not recoil, and he did not look impressed in the hollow, war-hungry way she had seen in men who liked the idea of violence. He looked at her the way someone looks when they are hearing something they understand is heavy, and they are not going to pretend otherwise. "Are you going back to your clan?" he asked quietly. "The clan is gone," she said. "Scattered, some surrendered and went to the treaty camps, some went north, some died." She looked at her hands around her mug. "I am the last of my mother's line." The silence after that was the kind that is weight. "I am sorry," he said, and because he said it simply, without reaching or trying to fix anything, she believed him. The lamb Pearl grew stronger every day. By the end of the first week, she was on her feet and eating, and had attached herself to Dura as enthusiastically as she had attached herself to Jacob, which Dura found deeply undignified and also somehow unbearable in its sweetness. She would come into the barn to help with morning feeding and find the creature pressing its forehead against her knee, and she would stand there for longer than she should, one hand resting on its warm back, feeling something she could not name. On the 9th day, the weather broke and the sun came out and turned the snow into a blinding field of white. Jacob came to the barn where she was mucking the stalls and said he needed to go into Redgate for supplies and asked if she wanted anything. She had been thinking about moving on. She thought about it every morning and had not yet moved. She said she would come with him. She did not examine the decision too carefully. The road into Redgate was a frozen wagon trail through stands of pine and birch that sparkled in the cold light. Jacob drove the gray mare pulling his supply wagon, and Dura sat beside him on the bench, her breath making clouds in the cold air. He talked about the land. This was where the soil changed from the good black earth to the harder clay and rock mix. That stand of birches was where he had once found a bear in summer, and they had regarded each other for a very long time before both deciding to walk in different directions. This creek ran full in spring, but dried to a trickle by August. She listened and watched the landscape, and there was a particular contentment in riding beside someone who talked the way Jacob talked, not filling silence for the sake of it, but sharing things he actually found interesting, trusting her to be interested too. Redgate was 30-some buildings strung along a single main road, with a trading post at one end and a tavern at the other, and various workshops and homes between. It had the look of a frontier town that had been there long enough to settle but not long enough to be comfortable with itself. There were new planks nailed over old on the storefronts, and the road was deeply rutted and only partially planked, and there were more horses than wagons and more rifles visible than Dura had expected. The moment the wagon rolled down the main street and people saw her, the temperature dropped. She had experienced this before and she knew the shape of it. The turning of heads. The stiffening of postures. A man coming out of the trading post with a bag of flour under his arm who stopped dead on the steps and stared. Two women crossing the road who reversed course and went back to the boardwalk. A group of 3 men outside the tavern who straightened and put their hands near their hips in the unconscious gesture of people reaching for something they may or may not be wearing. Jacob kept driving. He did not speed up and he did not tense, though she could see from the set of his jaw that he was aware of all of it. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the trading post and climbed down and held up a hand to help her down, which she did not need but she took, because she understood that the gesture was visible and deliberate. He was telling Redgate something with that extended hand, and the thing he was telling it was calm and clear. The man on the trading post steps heavy-set, red-faced, about 50, with a look of settled hostility, had not moved. "Walker," the man said. "Morning, Breck," Jacob said pleasantly, tying the mare to the post. "You want to tell me what you have got on your wagon?" "Came for supplies," Jacob said, turning toward the steps without any sign of hurry. "Need seed catalogs if they came in, and about 40 pounds of milled flour, and whatever is left of those iron staples you had last month." Breck's eyes moved to Dura. She stood beside the wagon and met his gaze with the steady, level look she had used on people who were deciding whether to try to kill her because the mechanism was the same. You did not look away. Looking away invited attack. You held the ground you stood on and you kept your hands still. "We do not serve orcs here," Breck said. "Good thing I am the one buying," Jacob said, and went up the steps and into the trading post, pausing at the door. "Come on in," he said, looking back at her. "I need to know if the iron staples are the right gauge. You have got a better eye for it." She did not have a better eye for iron staples, and they both knew it. But she climbed the steps past Breck, who made a point of not moving out of the way so that she had to pass within an inch of him, and she looked at him once as she passed with the full amber gold weight of her eyes, and he moved aside. Inside the trading post was dim and cluttered and smelled of leather and grain and lantern oil. A woman behind the counter, young, perhaps 20, with wide eyes, went very still at Dura's entrance. Jacob moved through the shop with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times, reading the crate labels, pulling a catalog from a stack, listing his order to the young woman who wrote it down with a hand that shook slightly at first and then steadied. Dura examined the wall of iron goods hooks and hinges and the staples Jacob had mentioned, and after a moment the young woman behind the counter said, very quietly to Jacob, "The staples came in last week. 2 sizes." "Which gauge are the larger ones?" Jacob asked. The young woman glanced at Dura, then away, then back, then said to Dura specifically, "They are the 3/4 inch. Is that what you need?" Dura looked at the staples, then at the young woman, who was doing something courageous in her small way, overriding whatever she had been told or whatever fear she carried to direct a simple, civil question at the orc woman in the room. 3/4 will do for what he needs," Dura said. The young woman nodded and wrote it down. Outside, while Jacob loaded the wagon, the 3 men from the tavern had drifted across the road and were standing about 15 feet away with the particular looseness of men who have talked themselves into something. One of them young, maybe 21, with a red kerchief and the restless energy of someone looking to prove himself, took a step forward. "That is an Ironhide brand on her arm," the young man said. "I can see it from here. Ironhide clan, they killed 40 men at the Coldwater crossing 2 years back. 40 men." Jacob did not look up from the bag of flour he was settling into the wagon. 40 men also died at the Greenville farm when the territorial militia burned the orc settlement there, he said. "Counting is complicated business. She is a warrior. She has got a weapon." "So does everyone in this town," Jacob said. And now he turned and faced the 3 men with his hands at his sides and his posture entirely unstrained. He was not a large man compared to any of them, and he was certainly not large compared to Dura, but there was something in the way he stood rooted, unafraid, with the particular calm of a man who has already decided where his line is, that took up a great deal of space. "I am going to finish loading my wagon now. My companion is welcome in this town for exactly as long as she would like to be here, and if anyone has a disagreement about that, I am glad to discuss it later over something to drink, but not today when I have perishables." There was a long, crackling moment. The young man with the red kerchief looked at Dura. Dura held his eyes with the same level, unblinking steadiness she had used on Breck. The young man looked away first. He stepped back. His 2 companions, reading him, stepped back also, and the moment dissolved the way these moments do when the person willing to escalate decides not to. Jacob finished loading the wagon. On the drive home, neither of them spoke for a long time. The pine trees cast long blue shadows across the snow. The mare's breath made rhythmic plumes in the cold air. "You did not have to do that," Dura said finally. "Yes, I did," Jacob said. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with an expression that was thoughtful and a little tired, not triumphant. "Just settled?" "Why?" she asked. It came out more genuine than she meant it to, less like a challenge and more like a real question, the kind you ask when you want to understand something about a person. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because it was right, and because you helped my lamb." "You keep coming back to the lamb," she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost a laugh. He glanced at her and the corner of his mouth curved. "Pearl is very important to me." It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it did something unexpected to her, that smile. It was an honest smile, a little crooked, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and she felt it somewhere in the middle of her chest like a warm coal settling. She stayed another 2 weeks after that, and then another week after that. The days developed their own texture. Morning chores, the animals, the firewood, the water from the well that froze over twice more in those weeks and had to be broken with the back of an axe. She and Jacob developed an easy division of labor. She was stronger and could handle the heavier tasks without effort, and he was knowledgeable about the land and the animals in ways she was not, and they found a natural rhythm that required almost no discussion. She watched him with the animals and was struck by the tenderness of it, the way he spoke to the horses while he brushed them, low and continuous, not expecting answers, just offering company. The way he checked Pearl's wound every evening with complete concentration, his hands gentle and sure. He was not a soft man. He had the hard edges of someone who had built a life through sheer physical work in a difficult country. but he was tender in the way that genuinely strong things can afford to be tender. She began to notice other things. The way his hands looked when he was working, capable, deliberate, nothing wasted. The way he laughed quietly at his own jokes before he finished telling them, as though he found himself mildly amusing, which she did too. The way he slept. She could sometimes hear him through the wall between their rooms, and he was entirely quiet, no restlessness, the deep, motionless sleep of someone with a clear conscience. She noticed that she noticed all of this, and it unsettled her. She had not allowed herself attachments. That had been practical at first. In the clan, warriors moved constantly, and the bonds you built were bonds you might have to grieve by next season. And then later it had been something else. The understanding that the world between orcs and humans left almost no room for the kind of connection she thought she might want, if she let herself think about it. She tried not to let herself think about it. One evening, about 5 weeks after she had arrived, she was in the barn after dark checking on Pearl. The lamb had taken to sleeping in a particular corner of the stall, and Dura had made a habit of stopping in before she went to bed herself. Not for any practical reason, but simply because the creature made her feel something she had no word for, and Jacob came in to do the same, and they both stopped when they saw each other. And for a moment the lantern light made everything amber and warm and close. "I do the same thing," he said, and he meant the lamb, but he was looking at her. "It is a useful animal," she said, and she meant it lightly, and she was looking at him. They stood for a moment too long on either side of Pearl's stall, and Dura was aware of the 3 feet of space between them with an intensity that was new and alarming. She said good night and went inside and lay on her cot under the wool blankets and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. In the morning, she told herself she was leaving the next day. She said this to herself for 4 more days before anything changed. What changed it was the wolf. She woke before dawn on a night in early spring when the snow had melted enough to show the mud beneath, and she heard something wrong in the sounds outside. Pearl was crying in the barn, a sharp, alarmed sound, and the horses were moving. She had her boots and her knife on before the thought was complete, and she was out the back door and across the yard in the blue pre-dawn dark. And she came around the corner of the barn to find a large gray wolf with its nose pressed to the gap in the barn wall where the planks had warped away from each other, pushing, trying to force through. She took it in with the combat quick visual assessment that 30 battles had made automatic. Big animal, hungry, brave enough to come close to a structure, focused on the barn rather than on her approach. She had her knife, but she did not want to kill it. It was a lean spring wolf doing what lean spring wolves did. And so she did what she had also learned in 30 battles, which was that a threat does not always require a weapon. She came at it hard and fast, arms wide, voice dropping to the full resonant roar that orc lungs were built for. And the wolf turned from the wall and she was already on it, and it saw her fully, the size of her, the sound of her, the gold eyes blazing in the dark, and it bolted. Gone into the tree line in 3 seconds, gone without looking back. She was standing in the muddy yard, breathing hard, listening to Pearl calm down inside the barn, when the farmhouse door banged open and Jacob came out at a run with his rifle up, scanning the yard. He saw her. He stopped. He looked at the tree line and back at her. "Wolf," she said. "You ran it off," he said. "Yes." He lowered the rifle and looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light, and there it was again. That expression, the one she was starting to be able to read, the warm, focused look of a man who is seeing something he finds extraordinary. He was in his undershirt and trousers, no coat, barefoot in the mud, and he had come out of that door running without hesitation with his rifle because he had heard a threat near his animals, and he had come anyway, which was a thing Dura understood entirely, which was the thing warriors understood about themselves and rarely found in others. "You came out with no boots," she said. He looked down at his bare feet in the mud. "I did," he acknowledged. "That is not smart." "No," he agreed. He looked up at her, and the pre-dawn light was exactly the color of cold water, and his expression was entirely open in the way of someone who has forgotten to guard themselves. "I heard you out here and I came out." She understood what he meant. He had heard a sound and come out because she was there, not just because his animals were at risk. She understood it, and it hit her somewhere under the ribs with a quiet force, like a door opening into a room that had been sealed for a long time. She said nothing. She went into the barn to check on Pearl and stayed there until she heard him go back inside. And then she stood in the warm, hay-smelling dark with one hand on the lamb's back and allowed herself, for the first time, to feel the full weight of what was happening to her. She was falling in love with Jacob Walker. It was inconvenient and probably inadvisable, and she was going to have to address it, and she had absolutely no idea how. The spring came in earnest over the following weeks, and the farm came alive in the way that farms do in spring. The sound of mud softening underfoot, the first green shoots along the fence lines, the ewes growing heavy with the lambs that had been conceived in fall. Jacob had bought 3 more ewes from a farm to the north during the winter, and by April he had 6 new lambs including Pearl, and the yard was chaos in the best possible way. Dura had planted a kitchen garden. She had not planned to. She had been watching Jacob prepare the garden bed one afternoon, turning the dark soil with a spade, and she had taken the second spade from the wall of the tool shed and started on the other half without discussing it, and that was that. She was not leaving. She had not said this aloud. Neither had he. But she was planting a kitchen garden, and she had stopped counting the days, and the travel pack that she had kept ready beside her cot, since the first day was now pushed to the back of the closet, and she had hung her knife belt on the hook beside the door where Jacob hung his coat, and these were the small, silent declarations of a person choosing to stay. One evening in late April she was sitting on the porch steps in the last of the day's sun, mending a fence post strap, and Jacob came and sat beside her on the step, not at the other end, not with any particular arrangement, just beside her, close enough that his arm was an inch from hers, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Are you happy here?" She looked up from the strap she was mending. The question was simple and direct, and she was not used to people asking it. Not anyone ever in her memory. Whether you were happy was not a question the clan asked. Whether you were ready to fight was a question the clan asked. "I think so," she said. It came out more honest than she had intended, more uncertain, more real. He nodded slowly, looking at the distant tree line where the last light was turning the birches gold. "I am glad," he said. "I want you to know that. I want you here." He paused, and then he said it again more quietly, turning to look at her. "I want you here, Dura." The way he said her name was different from how anyone had ever said it. Her clanmates had said it with the sharp, flat accent of the Ironhide tongue. Humans who had said it before him had said it with the clipped, awkward pronunciation of someone unfamiliar with the sounds. Jacob said it as though it was a word he was fond of, a sound that meant something particular to him, warm and deliberate. She looked at him. The evening light was doing extraordinary things to his face, and she let herself look, fully and without the careful neutrality she had been maintaining for months. He looked back with that same openness. "I have never stayed anywhere," she said. "Not by choice." "You are staying here by choice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." His hand moved toward hers on the step, very slowly, and she watched it come, and she did not move away, and his fingers settled over the back of her hand, her green-gray, battle-scarred, hard-worked hand, with a gentleness that was almost unbearable in its carefulness. They sat like that until the light was gone, his hand warm over hers, neither of them speaking, and it was the most peacefully exposed Dura Ironhide had ever felt in her life. The kiss came a week later, on a night when a thunderstorm rolled in off the mountains, and the whole sky cracked white over the farm every few minutes, and the thunder made the farmhouse walls tremble. Dura was not afraid of thunder. She had slept through artillery exchanges. But there was something about being inside, in the warmth, with the storm roaring outside, that made the farmhouse feel smaller and more intimate than usual. They had been sitting at the table after supper. him reading from a thick almanac and her sharpening her knife by the fire, when a particularly tremendous clap of thunder struck close enough that the lantern flame jumped, and Pearl, who had graduated from the barn to a corner of the kitchen because she was, according to Jacob, a particularly intelligent sheep, and therefore deserved indoor privileges, raised her head and bleated with great indignation. Dura laughed. She had not meant to, it came out of her spontaneously, a real laugh, full and unguarded, at this small animal complaining at the weather. Jacob looked up from his almanac and found her laughing, and the expression that crossed his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life: pure, unfiltered delight, the look of a man watching something he finds unutterably beautiful. She caught herself and looked away, and the laugh wound down, and the air between them was suddenly charged with something beyond weather. "Dura," he said. She looked at him. He had set the almanac down, and he was leaning across the table slightly, which brought him closer, and his eyes were steady and warm and entirely clear. "May I kiss you?" She had not expected him to ask. She had expected, if anything like this came, for it to arrive differently, sideways or accidentally or born of proximity rather than intention. The directness of it, the simple asking, undid her in ways she could not articulate. She stood from her chair and crossed to his side of the table, because crossing the distance felt like the right answer, and she bent toward him and he rose to meet her, and the kiss was quiet and warm and careful, his hands coming up to cup her face with the same gentleness he used with the animals, the same complete attention. She kissed him back with everything she was, very slowly, and she felt him breathe against her, and she felt his hands warm on her face, and she thought, with absolute clarity, so this is what I have been walking toward. Redgate did not leave them alone. It was a thing she had known was coming. She and Jacob had managed their public appearances carefully since the first supply run. He went to town alone for most errands, or they went together but quickly and purposefully, and she had become a familiar enough fixture on the road into Redgate that people had stopped double-taking. But familiarity is not acceptance, and tolerance is not warmth, and there are always the people for whom a thing that bothers them continues to bother them until they act on it. The acting came on a clear morning in late May, when Dura was in the yard splitting wood and Jacob had ridden to a neighboring farm to help with a fence repair, a 2-hour errand. She was working steadily, the axe rising and falling in the morning light, Pearl supervising from a safe distance, when she heard the creak of wagon wheels on the road. 3 men came down the access road on horseback. She recognized 2 of them, the red kerchief man from Redgate, whose name she had since learned was Corvin, and one of his companions from that first day. The third man was older and carried himself with the authority of someone who thought he had official standing, and he held a folded document. Dura set the axe head on the chopping block and stood with one hand resting on the helve and waited for them to come to her. They rode into the yard and stopped, and the older man held out the document toward her. "This is a territorial notice," he said. "Non-human residents of the border territories are required to register with the territorial authority. Failure to register is grounds for removal." She looked at the document. It was real in the sense that it had a seal on it. Whether the seal represented anything that had genuine authority this far out in the territories was another question. She had seen these kinds of notices before. They were tools, not law. "I am a guest on private land," she said. "Guest status requires the landowner's written declaration," the older man said. He looked pleased, the way people look when they believe they have arranged things so that the outcome is foregone. "Do you have one?" She did not. Jacob had not known they needed one. They had both assumed the land's privacy was sufficient. Corvin walked his horse a step closer. He was looking at her with the particular expression of young men who have never been in a real fight but have convinced themselves they understand violence. He was looking at the Ironhide brand on her forearm, the scarred circle with the clan mark, visible below her rolled sleeve. "Ironhide orc on Walker's land," he said. "People in town are talking. People are worried." 30 battles, that is what you people say, is it not? That she fought in 30 battles against us. In wars your kind started, Dura said quietly. You do not get to say that. I was there for all 30 of them, she said, and the quiet in her voice was the quiet she had used before battles, not the quiet of someone who is cowed, but the quiet of someone who is entirely certain. I know who started each one. I know the name of the settlement that was burned first and the year and the name of the officer who ordered it. Do you? Corvin went red. The older man cut in. The notice stands. The landowner must present himself with a written declaration within 10 days or the non-human resident is subject to removal. The word removal covered a range of things in the territories, and none of the range was good. She looked at the document in the older man's hand. Then she looked past them at the road and at the tree line beyond and made a very rapid calculation. I will relay the message, she said. She did not move from the chopping block. She did not retreat. She waited, hands easy, back straight, until the 3 men turned their horses and rode back out to the road and away. She waited until the sound of hooves had faded completely, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and was still for a few minutes in the way of a person processing something that has multiple edges. Jacob was back before noon. She told him plainly what had happened and put the name of the notice and the 10-day deadline in front of him like facts that needed to be addressed. He listened, and his jaw tightened, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come on." "Where?" "Redgate." She said, "You do not need to, Dura," he said, and the way he said her name this time had an edge in it that was not directed at her. "I want you here, not as a guest who might be removed. Here properly." He looked at her directly. "If you want that, I'm not going to press you into something you do not want. But if you want to stay and I want you to stay, I am being very clear about that. Then I would like to go to the registrar in Redgate and make a legal declaration, and I would like to do more than that if you are willing." She understood what more than that meant. She looked at him for a long time. "More than that," she said carefully, "would mean the people in Redgate would have to accept seeing us together, not just as landowner and whatever they have been calling me." "Yes," he said, "it would. Most of them will not like it." "No," he said, "they will not. Some of them will make trouble, probably," he said. "I know." And there was no hesitation in any of it, no flicker of weighing or calculating. He had already done the calculation and arrived here. She looked at her hands, at the brand on her forearm, at the kitchen she had worked in every morning for 4 months, at the hook by the door where her knife hung next to his coat. "I will go with you," she said. They rode into Redgate side by side on the wagon bench in the morning light, and Dura sat straight and did not look down at anything, and Jacob drove with his usual easy steadiness, and people on the boardwalks of the town stopped and stared with the frankly astonished look of people witnessing something they had not expected. The registrar's office was a small room off the trading post, managed by a sharp-eyed older woman named Helvin who had been the registrar for Redgate for 20 years, and who had, in that time, seen enough of the world not to be undone by any particular thing that walked through her door. She looked at Jacob, and then she looked at Dura with a comprehensive, measuring glance that was not hostile but was not warm either, just professional and honest. "Declaration of permanent residency, cohabitation of a non-human national on registered private land," Jacob said, setting his land papers on her desk. Helvin pulled the registration ledger toward her. "Standard terms require both parties to sign." She glanced at Dura. "Can you write?" "In 3 languages," Dura said. Helvin blinked once, and then a very small, involuntary smile crossed her mouth and disappeared. She turned the ledger around and offered the pen. Outside, after standing in the morning light on the front steps of the trading post with the document sealed and filed, Jacob turned to her, and she could see in his face that there was more he wanted to say but did not know how to start. She helped him. "You said more than that," she said. "I did," he said. "What did you mean by it?" He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small object, a ring, plain iron, clearly homemade. The kind of ring a man makes at his own forge when he does not have money for a jeweler and does not believe a jeweler is the point anyway. He had made it, she realized. He had made it before today, which meant he had been carrying the intention of this for some time. "I mean this," he said. He was not nervous exactly, but he was earnest in a way that went all the way through him. "I know the customs are different. I know in your clan there were different ceremonies. I am not asking you to do it my way or any particular way. I am asking if you want to do it together, some way that means something to both of us." He held the ring between his fingers, not pressing it toward her, just showing it. "I want you to be my wife, Dura, if you want that." She looked at the ring. Iron, unadorned. Made by the hands that had helped her nurse a dying lamb in a cold barn, that had passed her a mug of hot tea without making anything of it, that had touched her hand on the porch steps with that impossible gentleness. "In Ironhide tradition," she said slowly, "the declaration is made in the open air, in front of witnesses. You speak the other person's name and you say what you are choosing and why, and they do the same, and then you exchange something that you made yourself." He looked at the ring in his hand. "I made this myself," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." She took the ring from his fingers and held it for a moment and then looked up, past him, at the street of Redgate, where about 12 people were now very obviously watching from various distances and angles with various expressions ranging from disapproval to curiosity to the bright-eyed, stunned look of people watching something unprecedented. Good, she thought. Let them watch. Let them have a story to carry. She said in the old Ironhide tongue, the words that were the opening of the declaration, the words that said, "I see you clearly, I am choosing without compulsion, I am not afraid." And then she said in the common tongue, so that the witnesses could hear and would always know they had heard it, "I choose Jacob Walker. I choose this because he is honest and kind and strong, and because he looked at a dying lamb and at me on the same morning and saw something worth saving in both." She paused and steadied herself. "I am Dura Ironhide, and I have fought in 30 battles, and I was not afraid in any of them, but I am a little afraid of this, and I am choosing it anyway." She heard someone on the boardwalk make a sound. She did not look to see what kind. Jacob's eyes were bright and fixed on hers with that total clarity. He took a breath and said, "I choose Dura Ironhide. I choose this because she is brave and honest and full of a kind of goodness that took my whole life to find. Because she held a dying lamb and wept over it, and that told me everything I needed to know." He took the ring back from her and slid it onto her finger, which he had known without asking was the way she would want it done. "I am not afraid at all," he said, and he smiled, the crooked full smile she had first seen on the wagon ride home from Redgate months ago, "and I think that is because of you." She put both her hands around his face, and she kissed him there on the steps of the trading post in the main street of Redgate with 12 witnesses, and whatever this moment would become to them, and she felt him smile against her mouth, and she did not let go for a long time. The months after changed things, as declared things tend to do. There were people in Redgate who never came around. Breck at the trading post remained stiff and minimal in his dealings, and she accepted that as the cost of existence in a world that had not yet grown large enough for her. Corvin and his friends made a point of riding past the Walker farm occasionally, which Dura found more tedious than threatening, and after the third such occasion, Jacob rode out to meet them on the road with his rifle across his saddle, not raised, just present, and said, with that rooted unafraid calm that she had come to understand was one of the most formidable things about him, that they were welcome to continue their recreation elsewhere, and they did. But there were also the others. Helvan, who never became warm exactly, but who dealt with both of them with an increasingly unambiguous professional respect. The young woman in the trading post, whose name was Sable, who began to talk to Dura directly when she came in for supplies, and once quietly asked her to describe what the Eastern Territories had looked like before the wars, and listened with real attention to the answer. A neighboring farmer named Preet, a big-shouldered man of 40, who had settled the farm to the north with his wife and 3 children, who came by one afternoon with a wheel of cheese, and a somewhat formal air, and said that he had heard about the wolf and the spring lambing, and that any farmer who managed a flock that size in a season like this, one had his respect, and then asked Jacob whether he would be interested in pooling resources for the fall harvest. "You are collecting allies," Dura observed one evening after Preet had left. "I am making friends," Jacob said. He was at the stove, stirring something that smelled of sage and onion. "It is a slower process, but it holds better." She watched him cook and felt the particular fullness of a person whose life has come to contain things they were not expecting. The summer was the best of Dura's life. She understood this while it was happening, which was rare, and she allowed herself to understand it rather than holding it at arm's length. She and Jacob worked the farm together through the long, warm months, and there was deep satisfaction in it, in the physical labor, in the rhythm of days that had purpose and accumulation, in the visible evidence of effort becoming something real. The garden she had planted in spring produced in summer with an extravagance she had not anticipated, beans and squash and root vegetables crowding the beds, and she found herself enormously proud of it, which was the first time she had been proud of something that was not a battle. Jacob had added to the flock and repaired the fence lines and built a second stall in the barn, and there was a sense to the farm that summer of a place growing into itself, settling deeper, becoming more fully what it was intended to be. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the long northern dusk, and he read to her sometimes. He had a small collection of books, histories and almanacs, and a single novel that she found absorbing in a way that surprised her. Or they talked, the comfortable deep-going talk of people who have passed through the preliminary stages and can now say what they actually think. She told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about her clan mother's death at Stoneback Ridge, and she told him what it had been like to be the child raised specifically to be a warrior, to be trained from infancy toward a single purpose, to have no other vocabulary for herself. She told him about the 30 battles, not the strategy and tactics which she could have described in professional detail, but what it felt like. The cold before, the heat during, the terrible quiet after, walking among the fallen. He listened to all of it with complete stillness and complete attention, and sometimes at the end of these tellings, he simply put his arm around her shoulders and held her against his side and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and she found that a kind of comfort she had no name for and needed very much. She learned his griefs too, the death of his parents, the loneliness of the years before she came, a loneliness he had managed rather than felt, occupying it with work and practicality, not quite admitting it to himself. The way the frontier had stripped away some of the certainties he had grown up with and left him with a simpler, harder faith in the things he could see and touch and know directly. "You were lonely," she said one evening. "I was," he said, without making it small. "I did not know how much until you were here and I could compare." She thought about this. "I was lonely for 26 years, she said, "and I did not know the word for it because no one in my clan would have understood what I meant." He turned to look at her in the dusk. "You are not lonely anymore," he said. "No," she said, "I am not." He reached up and tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back behind one of her slightly pointed ears, a small gesture, wholly casual, entirely intimate, and she felt it all the way down to the soles of her feet. That night she went to his room rather than her own, and she knocked and he opened the door and looked at her in the lamplight with that steady, warm clarity, and she said nothing because there was nothing she needed to say, and he stepped back to let her in and closed the door softly behind her. What followed was slow and careful and tender beyond anything she had imagined, because Jacob Walker was the kind of man who treated everything important with the complete attention he gave to the small things. The lamb, the soil, the fence that needed mending, and she was to him something irreplaceable and important, and he handled her that way, which she found she needed desperately and had not known she needed. They were together in the warm, close dark of the farmhouse, the summer night breathing through the open window, and it was the most honest thing she had ever been part of, every wall she had ever built dissolving in the warmth of someone who simply saw her, fully and without condition. Afterward she lay with her head against his chest and listened to his heart, and he had one arm around her and his other hand moving slowly through her hair, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "All right," he said eventually, very quietly. "Yes," she said, "very." She felt his chest move with a slow, contented breath. "Good," he said. "Me too." She stayed. Of course she stayed. There was never any question after that. The autumn brought its own challenges. The territorial authority had not given up entirely on the matter of the Ironhide orc on Walker's land, and in September a different official came, younger than the first one, more bureaucratic in manner, with a sheaf of newer documents that cited a recent territorial ordinance regarding registered non-human residency and required, among other things, proof of economic contribution to the territory. He came to the farm rather than sending riders, which Dura gave him credit for, and he was professional rather than hostile, which made the encounter manageable. Jacob met him in the yard, and Dura stood beside Jacob and listened to the requirements with the focused attention she had used to listen to tactical briefings in another life. The economic contribution requirement was satisfiable. The farm had produced well and paid its taxes, and employed a seasonal farmhand during harvest. Dura herself had begun, through the spring and summer, to develop a small trade in a thing she had not anticipated. She was good at metalwork, specifically at the particular techniques of shaping and tempering that the Ironhide clan had developed for weapon maintenance over generations, and she had quietly begun taking small repair and commission jobs from farms within a half-day's ride who needed tools repaired or new edges put on blades. Jacob had set up a forge space for her in the lean-to on the south side of the barn, and she worked there on winter mornings and rainy afternoons, and the work had a quality to it that people noticed. She presented the official with the forge's commission log and the farm's production records and the tax receipts, and the official looked through them and made notes, and did not find anything to object to, and eventually said that the residency would be considered compliant subject to annual review, and left. "Annual review," Dura said, after he had gone. "Each year the record is better," Jacob said. "By year 3, even the most determined official will have a hard time making a case." "You thought this through," she said. "I have been thinking it through since March," he said. He looked slightly abashed in the way he looked when she caught him having been quietly strategic about something. "I wanted to make sure we were building something they could not easily dismantle. We were building something." She rolled the words over in her mind and felt them settle exactly right, like a stone into its proper place in a wall. "You are better at strategy than you let on," she said. "You are a veteran of 30 battles," he said. "I was not going to try to compete with you there." She walked to him and kissed him, which he received with warmth and returned with focus. And Pearl, who was still following both of them everywhere despite being now a fully grown ewe of complete dignity, buted the back of Dura's knee with her head in what she chose to interpret as endorsement. The winter after the first summer was different from the winter before it. They were together now in every sense, sharing the farmhouse's warmth with the unself-conscious ease of two people who have stopped treating the proximity as remarkable and have simply integrated it. Dura slept in Jacob's room on the broad, rope-sprung mattress under 2 quilts and the heavy fur he had bought from a trapper in October, and she woke each morning to the sound of him already up, the stove already lit, and this domestic routine was more satisfying than any victory she had known. She thought sometimes about the 30 battles. She thought about them the way a person thinks about a country they grew up in that no longer exists, with a complex acknowledgement that included grief and also something like relief. That life had made her. She could not disavow it. The discipline and the endurance and the particular kind of courage that comes from repeated exposure to mortal danger, these things were in her, and they were not nothing. They were part of what made her good at the work she did now, the forge and the farm and the daily management of a life that had to be maintained and protected and built. But she was not that life anymore. She was something else, something that had grown past it and around it, and this new thing had a name now, Dura Walker. She had taken it simply, without ceremony, because she wanted to, because the name meant something to her that went deeper than custom. She told Jacob on a winter evening, very matter-of-factly, that she was going to use his name. He was so still for a moment that she thought she had surprised him, and then she saw that his eyes were bright and he had to look down before he said, in a voice that was carefully even, "That means a great deal to me." "I know," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat in the stove-warm quiet, and outside the wind drove snow against the windows, and inside everything was entirely still. The news of the pregnancy came in spring, a year and a half after she had first knelt in the mud next to a dying lamb in a stranger's field. She told him in the barn, on a morning when the light was coming in through the boards in long gold columns. She had suspected for 2 weeks, and confirmed it through means she understood from her clan, certain physical signs that the Ironhide women knew to read, passed down through generations of women who had needed to know these things. Jacob heard her, and he stood in the barn aisle without moving for several seconds, and she watched his face do a series of things in quick succession, processing, understanding, and then something she could only describe as breaking open in the best possible way. He crossed to her in 2 steps and put his arms around her, both of them, and held her with his face against her neck, and she felt the long, slow breath he released against her skin. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. She put her arms around him and felt how completely she meant it, how entirely true it was. "I am perfectly all right." He pulled back to look at her face, holding her by the shoulders, and his expression was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life: wonder and love, and the particular look of a person realizing that the life they are living has become larger than anything they had planned. "Half orc," she said, because this was a thing they needed to name. "The child will be half orc, half human." "Yes," he said, "people will have opinions." "People always have opinions," he said. He brought one hand up to her face. "I am only interested in my own." "And what is your own?" she asked. "That this is the finest thing that has ever happened to me," he said simply. "And that I would like to be very sure you know that." She did know it. She could see it in his whole face, unambiguous and entire. She leaned her forehead against his and closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the barn around them, and the warmth of him, and the new, impossible warmth of the thing that was beginning. Pearl the ewe stuck her head around the stall door and made a thoughtful sound. "Oh, be quiet," Dura said to her, and Jacob laughed, and she could feel the laugh against her forehead, and she laughed too, and it was the sound of something that had fully arrived. The pregnancy was not easy. The physical difficulty of it was manageable. She was strong, and the early months of discomfort she navigated with the same stoic practicality she applied to everything, though Jacob fussed in ways she found alternately irritating and deeply touching, bringing her the ginger tea that helped in the mornings, and quietly adjusting the division of labor so that the heaviest tasks fell to him without making a production of it. What was harder was the external world. Redgate's opinion of an orc woman on Walker's farm had been a managed discomfort. Redgate's opinion of a visibly pregnant orc woman on Walker's farm was something else, and the something else had an uglier edge. There were comments in the street when she went into town for supplies, mostly directed at Jacob rather than at her directly, which she found more annoying than if they had been directed at her, because at least she could respond to things said to her face. Jacob managed these with the same rooted calm he brought to everything, which was to say that he neither ignored them nor escalated them, but addressed them directly when they warranted addressing, and let the rest pass by. Once, outside the tavern, a man made a comment that had a specific viciousness about the nature of the child she carried, and Jacob stopped walking and turned and looked at the man with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was something quieter and more absolute, and said, "I will only say this once, and then I will never say it again. My family is my family. The next man who has something to say about my family in my hearing had best be prepared for what follows. The town of Redgate was not a town of bad people. It was a town of people shaped by history and fear, and limited exposure to the kind of thing Dura and Jacob represented, and it was, slowly and unevenly, beginning to adjust. Sable from the trading post began to occasionally stop by the farm on her way home from work, first on invented errands, and then, as the summer advanced, simply because she had begun to think of Dura as someone she wanted to know. She would sit on the porch steps and ask questions about the Eastern Territories with genuine curiosity, and Dura answered them without softening the difficult parts, and Sable listened the way young people listen when they are genuinely revising their picture of the world. Preet from the neighboring farm came by regularly, and had developed an easiness with both of them that had the quality of genuine friendship. His wife, a sharp-tongued practical woman named Mara, had been skeptical at first meeting and then, on a subsequent visit when she had witnessed Dura handle a complicated lambing difficulty with calm expertise, and then immediately after sit down and eat an enormous amount of Mara's cooking with unaffected enjoyment, had declared her to be sensible, which in Mara's vocabulary was the highest possible compliment. Helvin the registrar, on the occasion when Dura came in to add the pregnancy to the residency record as required by the new ordinance, looked at her over the ledger for a long moment and said, "The territory is going to be a different place in 20 years. I think you and Walker are one of the reasons." It was the most she had ever said, and Dura took it with her and held it. The child was born in late autumn, in the farmhouse, with Mara in attendance and Jacob present the whole time, which was not the custom in the territory, but Dura had made clear that she did not care about the custom and Jacob had been entirely prepared to not care with her. It was a long labor, and she went through it with the silence of a person who has survived 30 battles and knows how to endure and focus, and Jacob held her hand the whole time, and was steady and present in the way she had come to rely on him to be steady and present, which was completely. The child was a boy. He was healthy and loud, and had his mother's amber gold eyes and his father's dark hair, and the slight greenish cast to his skin that marked his orc blood. And he was, in Dura's opinion, the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. They named him Rowan, because it was the name of the tree that had been growing outside the farmhouse window since before Jacob built the house, the one whose red berries blazed every autumn, and whose presence Jacob said had always made him feel less alone. "Hello, Rowan," Dura said, in the lamplight, holding the swaddled weight of him with a certainty she had not known she was capable of. She said his name in the old Ironhide way first, the soft rolling vowel that the common tongue did not quite have, and then in the common tongue, so that he had both. Jacob was beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, his eyes on the baby, and his face had the same broken-open look of wonder it had worn on the morning in the barn when she had told him. "He has your eyes," Jacob said quietly. "He has your chin," she said. "He is going to be stubborn." "That is inherited from both sides," Jacob said. Pearl, from the corner of the room where she had somehow arranged to be present, made a small domestic sound. "Yes," Jacob said to her. "He is here. You may mate him when he is older." Rowan Walker grew into the farm the way children grow into places that are built to hold them with the particular confidence of someone who is entirely at home. He was, from the beginning, a physical, curious, energetic child who took after both his parents in ways that manifested interestingly. He had Dura's directness and her unself-consciousness about her own strength. He was, by the time he could walk, substantially stronger than most children his age, and Jacob's patience, and his habit of paying precise attention to whatever was in front of him. He had no understanding of why he should find his appearance remarkable. This was because Dura and Jacob had, with deliberate forethought, constructed his world so that it simply was not remarkable. He knew that his mother was an orc and his father was human, and that he was both, the way you know the color of your own eyes, as a plain fact with no weight attached. The farm was his whole world in those early years, and the farm had Pearl and the horses and the sheep and the garden and his parents and Preet and Mara's children, who came over regularly and treated Rowan with the casual indifference of children for whom another child is just another child, and it was a good world. When he was old enough to begin going into Redgate, they went with him the first time as they had once gone together to register the land deliberately, side by side, presenting the thing plainly and letting the town look. He held Jacob's hand on one side and Dura's on the other, his amber gold eyes wide with interest, and people looked, as people do, and Rowan looked back with his mother's unflinching directness and his father's calm, and after a while the looking stopped being an event and became just the ordinary thing of people who know each other passing in the street. It took years, but it happened. Sable became, over those years, something closer to a genuine friend, to both of them, but particularly to Dura, in the way of people who connect across distances that should prevent connection and do not. She had ambitions beyond the trading post, and she read and thought more widely than most people in Redgate gave her credit for. And she had a particular interest in the orc cultures of the Eastern Territories that was genuine scholarship, rather than the morbid curiosity Dura had sometimes encountered. She and Dura talked about history and craft, and the way things were made and the way wars started, and the costs that outlasted the treaties, and Dura found these conversations clarifying in ways she had not expected. She began, with Sable's encouragement and Jacob's quiet support, to write things down. Her Ironhide tongue first, a grammar and vocabulary compiled from memory, because there were no other fluent speakers she knew of, and the language was disappearing as its speakers disappeared or were absorbed into the treaty camps. Then the history, the battles and their causes, the way the clan had lived, the names of the dead. She worked on it in the winter evenings at the kitchen table while Jacob read and Rowan slept, and the writing was grief and preservation at the same time, and it was important. She thought sometimes of her clan mother, who had died at Stoneback Ridge with an arrow in her throat and no words to leave behind. She thought of all of them, the warriors she had trained with and fought beside, the elders who had taught her the history she was now the only one writing down. She wrote their names. She wrote what she remembered of their faces. She was not the last of them quite, she had come to understand. There were treaty camp survivors, scattered and diminished, and the occasional report of Ironhide-blooded people in the Northern Territories. She had sent letters, through channels she developed slowly and carefully over the years, and had received 2 replies halting, cautious letters from people who were not sure what to make of an Ironhide woman writing to them from a human farm in the border territories with a human husband and a half-orc child. She wrote back carefully and honestly and left the door open, and one of the 2 eventually came, a young woman of 20 named Wren, who arrived on foot at the farm one autumn afternoon with a bedroll and a look of exhausted weariness, and stood at the gate looking as though she expected to be turned away. Dura went to meet her. She stood at the gate and looked at this young woman who had her clan mark on her forearm and the particular bearing of someone trained to fight since girlhood, and she felt something she recognized as kinship, the deep, specific kinship of shared formation, of being built by the same hands. "Come in," she said, in the Ironhide tongue, and watched the young woman's face open with something raw and relieved. "The stove is on." Wren stayed through the winter. By spring she had decided to stay longer, and Jacob had built a 3rd room onto the farmhouse with the calm practicality of a man who builds what is needed when it is needed, and she had begun to learn the forge work with an aptitude that Dura took satisfaction in teaching. The farm grew, and the community around it shifted, the way communities shift when the thing they have been pushing against turns out to be permanent and decent, and capable of producing good wool and reliable metalwork, and a half-orc child who helped Mara's youngest look for her lost kitten for 3 hours without giving up. Rowan was 5 when a second child came. This time Dura was easier in her body with it, knowing what to expect, and the birth was faster, and the child was a girl dark-haired like her father, with Dura's amber eyes and the same faint green cast to her skin, smaller than Rowan had been and very quietly watchful from the first hour. They named her Calla, after the wildflowers that grew along the creek behind the farm every spring, white and persistent, and appearing in the most unpromising ground. Rowan took his sister's arrival with extreme seriousness. He sat beside Dura on the bed and looked at the baby with an expression of complete concentration as though memorizing her. Then he looked up at Dura and said, "Does she know about Pearl?" "Not yet," Dura said, "but she will." Pearl was elderly by this point, white-muzzled and slower than she had once been, but still present and still apparently interested in proceedings. She had outlasted every other sheep on the farm by 3 years, and Jacob said she had done it through sheer personality, and Dura did not disagree. On a winter evening when Calla was 3 months old and Rowan was 5, and the farmhouse was full of the warm, contained life of people who have built something real together, Jacob found Dura at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, working on her history manuscript. He had 2 mugs of tea. He set one beside her without a word and sat across from her, and looked at her with the expression she had learned over all these years to read as completely. The full, warm, steady look of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. "What?" she said, because the look was more particular than usual. "I was just thinking," he said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "When I found you in the field that morning when you were kneeling in the mud holding that lamb, you snuck up on me," she said. "I would like to note that for the record." "You were crying," he said gently. "I was not." "Dura." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the snow was falling. She could hear the particular silence of heavy snowfall, the way it muffled and softened the world. Inside the stove was warm and the children were asleep, and from somewhere in the back of the house she could hear Wren moving around, the small, ordinary sounds of the house's life. "I was crying," she acknowledged. "For the lamb," he said. "For the lamb," she agreed. And then, because he was looking at her with that expression, and because she had been entirely honest with this man for years now and there was no reason to stop, she said, "And for myself. Because I had fought 30 battles and lost everything, and I looked at that animal lying in the mud, and it was very small, and everything was very big and cold." Jacob nodded slowly. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, as he had once covered it on a porch step at the beginning of everything. "You wept over a lamb," he said, "and I thought, whoever this woman is, she is not what the world has decided she is." She turned her hand under his and held it. "I am glad you did not run," she said. "I was never going to run," he said. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, in the warm, full quiet of the house they had built together. The house that held their children and their work, and the history she was writing, and the ring he had made with his own hands that she had worn every day since the morning he had offered it on the steps in Redgate. The house that had Pearl's wool somewhere and Wren's tools in the lean-to, and the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread, and the whole accumulated good smell of a life being lived. And she felt the truth of it, the full, complete, irreducible truth. She was home, not the home she had been born to. Not the Ironhide camp on the eastern range, not the sound of drums and the smell of war fires, not the clanmother's voice and the morning training ground and everything she had been made to be. That home was gone. It had burned and scattered and grieved itself into history, and she was writing that history down with care and love so that it would not be erased. But this home was real. This home was built by her own hands as much as by his. This home had her kitchen garden and her forge and her ring and her children and her husband, and it had Pearl, who was getting old but was still herself, and it had the particular amber gold winter morning light that came through the kitchen window exactly as it had done on the first morning when he had pushed a mug of tea toward her without making anything of it. "Jacob," she said. "Yes," he said, already looking at her. "I want you to know something." She steadied herself in the way of a person saying a true thing. I was not made for this kind of life. I was made for war. I was told that from the beginning and I believed it for 26 years and I was good at it. She looked down at their joined hands. But this, she lifted her eyes, this is the thing I was made for. I think I was made for this all along and did not know it. I think it was here the whole time, waiting. Jacob's eyes were bright. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles over the iron ring and held them there for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was very quiet and entirely steady, "It was waiting. I was waiting." He lowered her hand but did not release it. 26 years, he said. It was worth every one of them. The snow fell outside. The children slept. Pearl breathed in her elderly sleep in the warm barn. Wren's light went out in the back room. The stove ticked. Dura Ironhide, who had fought in 30 battles and wept over a lamb in the frozen mud of a stranger's field on the worst morning of her life, sat in her kitchen in the warm lamplight with her husband's hand in hers, and felt the absolute, undeniable, impossible fullness of it all. The forge would run again in the morning. The children would wake and need feeding. There was a section of the history manuscript still unwritten, the chapter on the third battle of the Coldwater Crossing, which she had been avoiding because it was difficult, and she owed it the difficulty. There was a fence post on the east side of the property that had been heaving with the frost and would need resetting before spring. There was Calla's first spring coming, and the garden to plan, and Rowan's lessons, and all the ordinary work of a day that accumulates into a year and a year into a life. She was not afraid of any of it. She had not been afraid of anything for a very long time, or rather she had learned what her fear was actually made of, which was not the risk of dying, but the risk of never having been fully alive. She had faced that risk and walked through it toward a man standing at a fence gate with a bucket and a coil of rope and an entirely unguarded face, and she had chosen, every day after that, to keep walking toward him. She had fought in 30 battles. She had wept over a lamb. She had been remade by a kindness so simple it still astonished her. And she had built from the ruins of what she had been something that would outlast her. A home, a history, a family, a place where the border between kinds was not a line in the ground but a question that two people had already answered together, quietly, without ceremony, by the ordinary daily practice of love. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Outside, the snow went on falling, soft and without malice, covering the fence lines and the garden beds and the path to the barn, and inside the farmhouse on the Walker farm, 2 miles from Redgate in the border territories, the lamp burned warm and steady and the night held.